In this video, we are talking about 10 sneaky starts and scary sits in week 9 of fantasy football. But before we get into it, if you do end up enjoying, if you could please like the video, subscribe to the channel. Starting with our sneaky starts, first guy up is Jakobi Meyers, who's coming off a nice performance in his first game back from injury. 6 catches, 52 yards, a touchdown on 7 targets, 17.2 fantasy points, and is the clear alpha in this Las Vegas wide receiver room with no Devontae Adams. Since week 4, Meyers has a 27% target share, 36% air yard share. Yes, Brock Bowers is still the motor of this offense. It runs through Bowers, but Jakobi is still a nice piece of it as well and gets another nice matchup against the Cincinnati Bengals, who have allowed the 7th most fantasy points per game to perimeter receivers, and it's probably going to be a favorable game script. The Raiders are probably going to be losing early in this one, meaning that they're going to have to throw the football a lot. So I'm expecting big games, obviously, from Brock Bowers, and I think Jakobi has another strong performance. So if you're looking for a desperation flex or you're dealing with a lot of injuries at the wide receiver position, I have a lot of confidence in Meyers to have a nice performance in week 9. Up next is Bo Nix. Never thought I'd be putting him on a start column, but he's impressed over these last couple of weeks and just had his best game of his young career. Yes, it was against the lowly Carolina Panthers defense, but 284 passing yards, 4 total touchdowns. He ended up running one in as well. 75% completion percentage, resulting in 29.8 fantasy points. He was a QB2 on the week in week 8, and he's finished as a top 12 quarterback in 3 out of his last 4 games. And since week 5, Bo ranks 7th in passing touchdowns, 9th in fantasy points per dropback, and he's been a threat as of late with his legs. He's been doing a lot more running, which has really boosted up his fantasy value as he ranks 4th in rushing yards among quarterbacks, 3rd in rushing touchdowns. So that's really nice. If you have a quarterback that can run the football, then that's a huge boost to their value, and that's what we're seeing with Bo Nix. And he gets another favorable matchup against the Ravens defense, who have allowed the most passing yards, passing touchdowns, and 3rd most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position. So maybe Nix doesn't rush in a score because we know how stingy the Ravens are on the ground, but I think he has a nice game through the air because the Ravens, as we know, you can throw on the Ravens, and they're probably going to be playing from behind. Similar situation like Jakobi Meyers. They're going to have to be keeping up with that Ravens offense, so expect Bo Nix to have another strong performance in week 9. Next man up is Cedric Tillman. I hope he's on your guys' roster. I told you to pick him up 2 weeks ago, and then we talked about him again last week. And what Tillman's been able to do over the last 2 weeks is legit. It's far from a fluke. 21 targets, 15 receptions, 180 yards, 2 touchdowns over that 2-game span. 18.1 fantasy points in week 7, 28.9 fantasy points in week 8. He's been sensational, and over that 2-game stretch among Browns wide receivers, he's 2nd in route participation, 2nd in target share, along with leading the team in air yards and end zone targets. Cedric has comfortably assumed this Amari Cooper role, and this role is a lot more valuable now that Jameis Winston is under center. He's just a better quarterback than Watson is at this point, and he's more willing to throw the football, kind of has that YOLO mentality, but we like that in a quarterback, especially for fantasy. Yes, it's a tougher matchup against the Chargers, but I think Tillman is still a player. You probably spent a lot of your fab to get him. I think he needs to be in your flex. I think he still has another really nice day, maybe not 29 fantasy points, but I think he has 15 to 18 fantasy points, which would be really nice to have from someone that is in your flex. So get him in your lineup. On to my next guy, a name we haven't talked about in a while because he's been hurt, and that is TJ Hockenson, who is going to make his season debut in week 9 coming off that torn ACL. And if you've had him stashed on your IR spot for the last 2 months or so, why not play him at this point? Like, we know the tight end landscape overall hasn't been great. Outside of last week on National Tight Ends Day on Sunday, where it felt like every tight end in the league scored, the position hasn't been that impressive this year. So I have no problem putting Hockenson in my tight end 1 spot if you don't really have a reliable option elsewhere. And Minnesota's head coach Kevin O'Connell has already come out and said that TJ would not be on a snap count. Obviously, we know there's still some risk involved. Like Hockenson coming off that injury, he's probably going to be rusty. You know, what if he is on a snap count? Like, we don't know if the head coach is telling the truth or not, or what if he's just not that effective while he's out there. We don't really know. But I think he's a sneaky start, a guy that you can roll the dice on and you just hope for a touchdown, which very well could happen on Sunday Night Football against the Colts, who have allowed the 7th most fantasy points per game to the tight end position. So I don't have a problem putting him in your lineup. If you start 2 tight ends, Hockenson definitely needs to be in there, but it also wouldn't shock me if he had 4 catches for 60 yards and a score. On to my last sneaky start of week 9, sleeper pick, you can call it that as well, and it's Xavier Worthy, who has seen some nice usage since Rashee Rice went down, but really hasn't been able to do much with it. Outside of getting in the end zone last week, he has 8 targets in back-to-back games, which we like to see, earning a 28% target share since Kansas City's bye. I do think the addition of DeAndre Hopkins actually is going to be a good thing for Worthy. Take the attention off the explosive rookie. Worthy is more of a gadgety type of player, deep threat, and opposing defenses can focus on Hopkins, focus on Kelsey, and I think that's just going to open things up for Xavier. And I think Hopkins is going to be more involved this week. I mean, you could argue he might steal some targets away from Worthy, but Xavier is one of those guys that just needs 1 or 2 plays to hit, and then he pays off. He can get you 15 fantasy points in a blink because of his explosiveness, because of his versatility. So I like Worthy in your flex this week. I think he has nice upside. He's still on a really good offense in Kansas City, and they're going to need him. They don't have Rashee Rice. They don't have Isaiah Pacheco. They don't have much on offense. So Worthy, even with Hopkins there, is going to be heavily involved, and it could be a high-scoring game, potential shootout against the Tampa Bay Bucks, who are somehow still a pretty good-looking offense with no Chris Godwin, no Mike Evans. Baker Mayfield continues to play really good football, and the Bucks have allowed the 4th most fantasy points per game to receivers. So if you think you're going to lose your matchup, you're playing a better team, and you want to throw someone in your lineup that has some risk, but his upside is through the roof, then get Worthy on your starting roster this week. All right, now on to some scary sits, some guys that I think need to be on your bench this week. It might be hard to swallow. It might be kind of scary, but I wouldn't be playing these guys if I were you. Starting with J.K. Dobbins, who hasn't really looked that great since he went crazy in week 1 and week 2. But from week 3 on, Dobbins is averaging 3 yards per carry, along with ranking 46th in missed tackles forced per attempt, 49th in yards after contact per attempt, and he's been held to single-digit fantasy points in 3 out of his last 5 games. Yes, Dobbins is still the focal point of this Chargers rushing attack, but another thing that's not great for Dobbins is the Chargers aren't running the football as much. Coming out of the bye, they've turned into more of a pass-happy offense. Yes, Dobbins is still going to get his 15-plus touches a game, but he hasn't really been doing much with them, and that's why I've been talking about for 3+ weeks now, you need to be stashing Kimani Vidal on your bench because I think he's a really good running back, and I think he's going to get a big opportunity whether Dobbins gets hurt or not. So get Vidal on your team right now for cheap before it's too late. And the matchup isn't great either against the Browns, who have allowed just 84 rushing yards per game this season and the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to the position. So it's really a combination of a couple different things. Dobbins not really looking that great over the last 5 weeks or so. The Chargers also not running the football as much as they did in week 1 and week 2, and it's a tough matchup. So if you have a better option, I would be leaving Dobbins on your bench this week. Next up is Zay Flowers, who has had a really strong year 2. We talked about him all offseason, thought he was going to break out. Here we are. He's playing really well. Wide receiver 26 in fantasy points per game, along with earning a 25% target share, but Flowers doesn't really score touchdowns as he only has 1 on the year and has not seen a red zone target since week 2. When they get in close, it's the Derrick Henry show, or it's a short pass to Mark Andrews for a touchdown, who I believe is riding a 3-game touchdown streak, Andrews that is, so that kind of makes Flowers a very boom-bust player because he doesn't score touchdowns. This has nothing to do, though, with the addition of Deontay Johnson. I don't think Johnson does much in his first game as a Raven, considering they just traded for him. He probably has a couple of plays, but won't really impact Flowers at all. The bigger concern for me here is Pat Surtain, the lockdown corner for the Broncos, if he shadows Flowers, which he might, because Baltimore doesn't have many good pass catchers outside of Zay, which means that Surtain has no other reason but to follow Flowers, who is their best receiver by a lot. And if that were to happen, if Surtain were to shadow Flowers, that would not be good news for Flowers, as Surtain has held DK Metcalf, Garrett Wilson, George Pickens, and Mike Evans to less than 30 receiving yards each when he has been covering them. So he's a lockdown, shutdown corner. If you have a better option, I would leave Flowers on your bench. On to my next guy, Rashod Stevenson. It'll be hard to keep Stevenson on your bench after he scored 2 touchdowns, 23 fantasy points in week 8, but he was terribly inefficient on the ground as he had 20 carries go for 48 yards. I will say though, Stevenson, from an advanced metric standpoint, has looked pretty strong as he ranks 13th in missed tackles forced per attempt, 12th in yards after contact per attempt. The issue here is this Patriots offensive line stinks. They're not doing Stevenson any favors, and that's not a good thing when it's a really tough matchup like it is this week against the Tennessee Titans, as Jahmyr Gibbs is the only running back to rush for at least 45 yards and score a touchdown against this Tennessee defense. So it's a brutal matchup. Stevenson has been hot and cold. He's really hard to trust. He's not been very efficient with his touches. He's running behind a bad offensive line. All of that put together, he should be on your bench if you have a better option in week 9. Next up is Calvin Ridley, who I'll admit, he put on a show in week 8 with a monster game, 10 catches, 143 yards on 15 targets, 22.6 fantasy points, but I would not get too excited just yet because we know Detroit is a very beatable secondary, and how much can we really trust Mason Rudolph, Will Levis at quarterback in this offense? Like, terribly hard to trust. Besides, this was only Ridley's second game with more than 55 receiving yards. And yes, the arrow is pointing up for Ridley, as he is the clear-cut #1 target in Tennessee with DeAndre Hopkins now in Kansas City. But he draws a tough matchup in week 9 against the New England Patriots and Christian Gonzalez. It's more about Gonzalez shadowing Ridley. We know the Patriots secondary is nothing special, but if he gets shadowed by Gonzalez, that would be really bad for Ridley. I just don't trust it yet. It's nice to see, but I don't trust this offense. I don't trust the quarterback play. And if it's a relatively difficult matchup, which it is, against a really good corner, then I would be staying away if possible. On to my last guy that you should probably sit, and that is Rashad White, who has surprisingly been cooking over the last 2 weeks. 29 fantasy points in week 7, 15 fantasy points in week 8, along with 3 touchdowns over that span. And he's also looked pretty good doing it. 18th in missed tackles forced per attempt, 11th in yards after contact per attempt. And that's typically not what we see from White. We don't really see that type of efficiency, but maybe Bucky Irving playing really well lit a fire under White. I don't know. But this week, I would not be getting too excited about Rashad, even though he's coming off a big game, as Kansas City is one of the worst matchups for running backs, as they've allowed just 3 yards per carry and only 2 rushing touchdowns on the year, along with the 9th fewest receiving yards and 0 receiving touchdowns. So it's not a good matchup on the ground or through the air for White. So another guy that, yeah, he's coming off a big game, but I'm not getting too excited, mainly because it's a brutal matchup against the Chiefs in week 9. That's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching. If you took away anything from the video, if you can please like the video, subscribe to the channel. It helps me out more than you know, and I will see you in the next one.